her to the thief. There's too much confusion, I can't get no relief. Businessmen, they drink my wine, come and dick my ass. None of them have along the line know what any of it is worth.
In Orwell's 1984, a memory hole is something used to rewrite the past. The old documents are destroyed in a memory hole and replaced by new documents. The past, as Orwell writes, is whatever the records and memories agree upon. In popular culture, the term memory hole has come to describe something which we've intentionally or unintentionally forgotten or misremembered. This video is about how we misremember Vietnam. The Vietnam War is the great American tragedy, a decade of agony. Its participants and victims are still feeling the scars over 50 years later. In processing the collective trauma of the conflict, we've ended up memory holing certain parts of it and reinforcing particular narratives. Narratives which don't line up with the records. It's important that we examine and interrogate these narratives because it helps us better understand how collective memory shapes our view of the past. It's probably the defining image of the 1960s, right? Scores of young people taking to the streets, protesting an immoral war. But when we look at the movement, we find that it never really achieved mainstream support in the 1960s. And it tells us a lot about class and privilege in America at the time. The first stirrings of resistance to the war started in university campuses, and throughout the conflict were the nuclei of resistance. This meant that most activists were young, well-educated, middle class, and usually already involved in political or social movements. But how much does this represent the ordinary American? In an opinion poll from 1965, when asked if sending troops to Vietnam was a mistake, only 24% of people said yes. 60% of people said it wasn't. Even as the war progressed and casualties increased, public support still remained high. In the same poll, conducted during the Summer of Love in 1967, more people thought that sending troops was a mistake, but over half of Americans still did not object to US troops being in Vietnam. In fact, in a poll taken in the winter of 1967, 63% of Americans favoured escalating the war. Not limiting, not de-escalating, escalating. This was actually an increase over the previous year. The 1960s may be remembered as a peak of the anti-war movement, but it's when support for the war was at its strongest. Not until the 1970s did polls reflect the modern perception of resistance to the war. In 1971, 60% of people said it was a mistake. Only 31% said it wasn't. A distinction needs to be made between anti-war activists and ordinary people who didn't like the way the war was going. This is one of the issues with relying on opinion polls, because there's so many different degrees of opinion. Many Americans agreed on principle with the anti-war movement, but disagreed with their methods. They were alienated by the long hair, music, substance use, and with the more radical elements who often made inflammatory statements. The often privileged background of many activists led to some disconnect when trying to spread their message. A campaign called Vietnam Summer in 1967, which focused on door-to-door campaigning, often ran into hostility and apathy when in working-class, poorer neighbourhoods. It's easy to forget just how unpopular anti-war protesters were in America at the time. When protesters and police clashed at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968, over half of Americans approved of the way that the police handled the demonstrators. When 4 students were tragically killed by National Guardsmen at Kent State University in 1970, over half of Americans thought the killings were justified. We imagine the anti-war movement as something which swept up millions of young Americans, a tidal wave of protest. But the reality is quite different. We focus so much on the hippies and the protesters because we view them as the good guys in this whole messy affair. It makes us feel better about ourselves if we can vicariously associate with them instead of ordinary middle America or, God forbid, the soldiers who actually had to fight. Let's talk about the draft. The draft looms large in popular consciousness about the war. You could be selected at any time and sent off to fight. In response, scores of young men would resist the draft by burning their cards or fleeing to Canada. But maybe the draft wasn't the all-encompassing boogeyman that we've come to think it was. For a start, it was surprisingly easy to be legally exempt from the draft. If you were married between 1963 and 1966, worked in an important industry, or were a college student, you could be exempt from the draft. In fact, 3 presidents, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump, all avoided combat by being in education. Talk about great American patriots. In fact, of the 27 million men who were eligible for the draft, over half were exempt from service. Of the remaining eligible men, only 1 or 2% actually refused the draft. For all we focus on draft dodgers fleeing to Canada, we neglect to mention that 30,000 Canadians volunteered to fight. More than 8.5 million draft-age men would serve in the military during the Vietnam War, but less than a quarter of these were actually drafted. As much as we'd like to believe that everyone was drafted into Vietnam against their will, the reality is the vast majority volunteered for service. However, it's important to remember that the draft was deeply unfair and gave more avenues for exemption to the middle and upper classes. Roughly 8 out of 10 drafted men were from working class backgrounds.
The draftees who fought and died in Vietnam were primarily society's losers, the same men who get left behind in schools, jobs, and other forms of social competition.
African Americans made up around 1 in 8 of the US population, yet in 1965 accounted for a quarter of all combat deaths. 42,000 Native Americans served during the war, the highest per capita rate of any ethnic minority. As the war progressed, the draft was made fairer in its selection, meaning that some men who were previously exempt were now eligible, and this had consequences for the anti-war movement.
It shifted from a moral movement to a self-interest movement, driven by people who didn't want to go to war and their loved ones who didn't want them to go to war.
Whilst many didn't care about the war when thousands of poor young men were dying, they only began to care when it started knocking against their door. It's common to hear that 500,000 military personnel deserted during Vietnam, more than any other American conflict. This is a real number, but it's not being entirely honest with the data. The army defines desertion as being away for longer than 30 days. Only 1 in 5 deserters actually were. The vast majority were away for a few days or weeks, or staying longer on R&R than they were supposed to. Up to 9 million military personnel served during the Vietnam War, but only 2.7 million were actually in Vietnam. So someone who is on base in the US, gets bored, and decides to go home for a few weeks is counted in the same statistic as someone who actually deserts from their unit whilst in Vietnam. The number of desertions actually recorded inside Vietnam? 5,000. About 0.1% of everyone who served there. In terms of direct refusal to fight in a combat zone in Vietnam, there are only 24 recorded cases. One defense report suggests that only 1 in 8 deserted because they were morally opposed to the war. Over half deserted because of family or financial reasons. So, whilst technically the Vietnam War saw more desertions than any other American conflict, the vast majority of these took place inside the United States and had little to do with being morally opposed to the war. The popular image we have of the Vietnam experience, dense jungle firefights, napalm explosions, was only experienced by a tiny portion of people and mostly informed by what we watch on the screen. The vast majority of soldiers never actually fight. Only 1 in 7 draftees during Vietnam actually saw combat. War films aren't very accurate because it would be very boring to show everyone in camp all day. As exciting as it would be to say that my grandfather fought Nazis in North Africa during World War II, in reality, he drove trucks in transport units. Still a very important job, but truck drivers don't become the main characters in war films. When I was putting this video together, I watched a lot of Vietnam War films and documentaries. And if I had to pick my favourite, I'd probably say, Good Morning Vietnam! I know everyone talks about Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, Apocalypse Now, but to be honest, they conform quite strongly to a lot of the narratives I've already covered, and are probably one of the reasons we have them to begin with. But Good Morning Vietnam subverts the form by being a mostly light-hearted film. It shows soldiers just hanging out and having a good time. It commits the cardinal sin of joking about the war, when the vast majority of films treat it deathly seriously, no pun intended. It's quite similar to Peter Jackson's They Shall Not Grow Old, in that in the midst of very serious commentary, it also has the bravery to show soldiers actually enjoying the war, when the norm of the genre is to show them hating it. It also refreshingly gives a lot of attention and agency to the actual Vietnamese people. Normally, Vietnam and its people are treated as simply a background for a story which focuses on American soldiers. This time, we really get to see what Vietnam was like for ordinary citizens. Finally, the music is superb and goes way beyond the often trite use of Paint It Black and All Along the Watchtower. It's a genuinely immersive 1960s soundtrack. My second favourite is Rambo First Blood. What I like about it is that it has the bravery to, just 7 years after the end of the war, confront the brutalization of American soldiers and their treatment when they came home. These majority young working class men were traumatized by the conflict and came home to a society which both ignored and rejected them. Whilst most popular Vietnam films carry a fairly generic and slightly tired war is hell theme, Rambo confronted the audience with an unpleasant reminder of how they treated deeply scarred veterans.
You just don't turn it off! And I come back to the world, and I see all those maggots at the airport, protesting me, spitting, calling me baby killer and all kinds of vile crap. Back there I can fly a gunship. I can drive a tank. I was in charge of $1 million equipment. Back here, I can't even hold a job. Fucking guys! Ah! I can't. Oh. Just. Oh, God.
After watching these films, Platoon starts to feel like an excessive melodrama. Media both informs and reflects popular culture. On the one hand, they help create some of these narratives and memory holes, but on the other, they simply amplify what we already chose to believe anyway. So I don't lay the blame for these memory holes entirely at the feet of filmmakers. Rather, I think they're a conduit for something bigger, amplifying the cultural memory which we ourselves have decided to shape. Making this film made me reflect on how we remember the conflicts of our own time, Iraq and Afghanistan. If you asked British people today whether they supported the Iraq War in 2003, most people would probably say no. There's a certain level of shame associated with the conflict. We don't want to admit that we supported it. When YouGov in 2015 asked people the same question, 37% of people said yes. But let's look at the actual polls from 2003. In just 12 years, 17% of people had conveniently forgotten that they supported it. We're so ashamed of what happened in Iraq that a good portion of people will simply memory hole their own support of it. In America, it's even more staggering. Only 38% of people remember supporting the war in 2003, but in actual fact, 63% of people supported it at the time. The reason we have all these memory holes about the Vietnam War is because we want it that way. And the reason we're beginning to memory hole our own recent past is because we want it that way. Both conflicts elicit strong feelings of shame in the collective consciousness, and in trying to process that, we end up memory holing parts of it. Like any oft-repeated story or personal memory, it changes every time we tell it. I've put this at the end so that it doesn't interrupt the flow of my argument, but I've got quite a personal connection to this period of time. When I was about 16, I got really into protest music. Bob Dylan, Pete Seeger, Joan Baez, Peter, Paul and Mary, all those musicians. And naturally, I thought that I was going to be the next big protest singer. Unfortunately, I wasn't very good, but anyway, I would go to protest marches and sing in the local political activist community, and although I was living in the 21st century, my mind was firmly in the 1960s. And I realised that I was artificially inflating the protesters' role in history. I genuinely thought that we could all hold hands and sing Kumbaya and then we'd have world peace. And so I'm saying all of this to you, but also to my younger self, because ultimately it's my generation who are inheriting these memory holes, and who will, if efforts aren't made to the contrary, perpetuate them.
The Eastern world is exploding, violence flaring and bullets loading. You're old enough to kill, but not for voting. You don't believe in war, or what's it gonna